Good evening. Tonight, ICCO Canada and myself would like to welcome back the consortium of Prosciutto di Parma, who sponsored this series of classes. Also, welcome Roberto Fracchioni, chef, food consultant, and the Canadian brand ambassador of the Prosciutto di Parma. Don't miss our Tutti a Tavola in Calabria class next Tuesday. And finally, remember to register for the ICCO Canada Pentola d'Oro Under the Stars event on Wednesday, November 25th, our online event featuring excellence in food and wine, with the participation of a Michelin star chef live from Italy and the award-winning ceremony of outstanding Canadian and Italian individuals and businesses who made a difference in the food and beverage industry. For this event, you will be able to order an exclusive dinner kit and have it delivered to your homes just in time to taste it while you follow the event live with us. But now it's time to start our class for tonight, and I think Roberto is ready. So please, Roberto.
I am.
Start. Hi, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
I just noticed that in the video, there was the same prosciutto slicer that you have. Is that right?
Well, no, I mean, it's the same style. That one is a Berkel. It's a much nicer one. This one is pretty awesome, but that's just a different brand. It's still the right way to slice prosciutto, and it's one of the first things we're going to do today is actually get back there and start using this monster. So welcome, everybody. It's kind of weird to be doing a class in the middle of the night, it feels like, but I'm glad you've joined us. Today, we're going to do a couple things with prosciutto, and again, I'm cooking with it. We all know how to slice it for charcuterie boards, but today we're going to cook it in two different ways, and we're going to use two different parts of the prosciutto. So the first thing that we're going to do is, like I said, go back to the slicer and slice some prosciutto di Parma. So off we go. So this is a proper prosciutto slicer. So these machines are designed to slice prosciutto. If you walk into a restaurant or you go to a deli and you actually see one of these slicers, you know that they take it seriously. The reason this is much superior is that the blade itself spins a lot slower, so it doesn't melt the fat. And I always talk about the fat in the prosciutto, about leaving it on, make sure that you don't trim it off because that's where the flavor is. So with this machine, we slice it nice and thin. The fat doesn't melt. It stays intact. It's everything so that we can enjoy the prosciutto the way that it should be. So we're going to slice some prosciutto super thin again. So we crank. First one is always a little bit ugly, but that's okay. And again, super, super, super thin. Now, generally, when you go to a deli, they'll usually slice it a lot thicker because that's what their machines are set for. So don't be afraid to ask them to slice it a little bit thinner. That's a beautiful slice. So this is all we really need, is 5 or 6 pieces plus a couple to snack on while we're cooking. But again, super, super, super thin. You see the light through there. You should be able to see right through it. If not, it's too thick. So we take our prosciutto and we head back over to the cutting board where we're going to start doing the assembly of the veal dish. So for the assembly of the veal dish, first thing we have to do is butcher our veal. So we have a little veal tenderloin here. So veal tenderloin, you can find it at most good butcher shops will have it. If they don't have tenderloin, you can use an eye of round, or you can use like a veal strip loin, but you don't want to use like a shoulder or anything like that. You want a single muscle. So if you look at this piece of meat, it's one single muscle. There's no connective tissue. There's no like 3 or 4 pieces of meat overlapping. It's just one big piece of meat. And that's what we want to look for. Now, to clean it, quite often it'll come fairly clean, but you just want to look out for little pieces like this. So that's a little bit of silver skin. And what that is a connective tissue that is on the exterior of the meat that if you go and cook it, it won't break down. It'll stay tough. It's elastin is what it's really called. And it stays really tough. And that's what those little things that you get stuck in your teeth that makes you beg for a toothpick when you're eating meat. It's usually these little bits of elastin. So what we want to do is we just want to shave it off. Try not to take off too much meat. And you just go and remove those little pieces if you see any of them. Now, again, it depends where you get it. Sometimes they're perfectly clean. I left those ones on just to show you guys how to remove the silver skin. So now we have a nice clean piece of meat. On the bottom side here, this is fat. And we want to keep any fat that's on the meat on there. So you can tell the fat because it's white and it kind of pulls off really easy. So if it does that, leave it on there. Fat is flavor. So don't worry about that. The silver skin, the elastin, you'll see it's kind of silvery. It looks like a big piece of plastic. So that's what we want to remove. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to open this up because we're going to stuff it. Now, there's a couple ways to stuff a piece of meat. You can just sort of poke a hole in one end, poke a hole in the other end with, a steel, the knife sharpener steel thing, or a very long knife. The problem with that is you don't get a nice even filling on the inside, and then you're like jamming it in there. It's very violent. I don't like doing that. So we're just going to open it up and do it properly. So we lay our meat out nice and straight, nice and flat. And with your knife, vertical, we just make a small slice about 1/2 of an inch from the outside of the meat. Go back about 1/2 of an inch, and then you do that again. Now, veal tenderloin is very, very soft, so it doesn't take much to cut. And then you'll see that this flap will sort of start to fall off in the main muscle. So from here, you can either roll it and keep on using your knife vertically if you feel comfortable with that, or I'm kind of doing this backwards, but you can just put your knife horizontally and slice it again, trying to keep that 1/2 inch measurement from your knife to the cutting board. Now, I'm drawing my knife. You'll see how when I'm not going in and I'm not sawing. It's not a piece of wood. It's a piece of protein. So I'm just drawing my knife. That means you just pull it straight. And what will happen is you'll get a nice smooth cut and you'll end up opening up your tenderloin. And you just keep going until you get to the end and you can't cut anymore. And you end up with a nice big flat piece of meat, which is a beautiful little, oh, that's nice. A beautiful piece that we can do a lot of. So what we want to try and maintain is a nice thickness, a nice even thickness all the way across so that it cooks nice and evenly. If there's a couple waves in there, don't worry about it. You're not going to ruin it. But the first side that we cut ends up tapering. You can see how it gets really thin. Make sure that that stays away from you because that's the side that we're going to finish with. So first thing we do is wash our hands really quick. And we add a little bit of salt and pepper. Now, I'm not going to go crazy with the salt, but I am going to put a good amount of pepper in here. So the salt, because we're using the prosciutto, you don't have to go too crazy with the salt. And I'm going to put a little bit because it's sea salt and it tastes really nice. So a little bit of salt on there. Now we're going to start layering all the fillings into it. So you can do this with anything. You can fill a piece of veal with pretty much any flavor you want. First thing, as long as it's not too strong. But first thing I'm going to do is lay a good amount of prosciutto in there. So one thing, always make sure that you're laying them the same direction with the fat. See how the fat is on this side? And then the next piece of fat, because I'm going to overlap this about halfway, I want to make sure that the fat is on that same piece, like the same direction. Like when you buy a package of bacon, they're all laid out the same way with the fat facing the same way. That's how we want to make sure that our prosciutto goes in. So I'm going to do 3 pieces. And this is adding flavor to the veal. It's adding a lot of fat to the veal, which is what we want, because veal is a fairly lean piece of meat. So we want to make sure that we add a lot of fat to it. Next thing we're going to do is add some artichokes. So these are just, canned artichokes. I went to open the jar because I was going to take it out and put it into a nice little cup, but it was really tough. So I wanted to show you guys something. When you get a jar and it's stuck and you start going crazy and you start running it under hot water, or you start asking people around the house to open it up, you don't have to. I'm going to show you guys a great trick. Grab a spoon. On the bottom side of the lid, just stick the tip of a spoon in here and then pry it open. Just pull it back. It opens the airlock, and then the lid pops off super easy. So you don't have to go get those little grippers. You don't have to strain yourself trying to open it up. Just with a spoon, pop it, put it underneath the lip, pull it back. You'll hear the pop of the lid breaking the airlock, and then it comes right out. Hope that's helpful. Any questions before I keep going, Tiziana?
Yes, actually, we're starting to get questions, and one is, can you use pork or beef tenderloin instead? And how about
Absolutely.
chicken? I'm adding, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can. With beef, it's hard because beef is, it has a pretty strong flavor. So you would need more prosciutto in order to actually taste the prosciutto, but you absolutely could stuff a piece of beef with prosciutto. Prosciutto, when you're cooking with it, really you substitute it anywhere that you would normally use bacon or pancetta. So what I'm doing here is I have a couple big pieces of artichoke, so I'm just cutting them in half because I don't want them too chunky in the filling. Any other questions, Tiziana?
Well, and there was a similar one inquiring about veal chops. If you can, do this recipe with the veal chop.
With a veal chop, it's hard because you can't really open it up.
Right.
Like you can't open it like this. A veal chop, you can stuff it, but what you basically do is cut a hole inside the loin. So if you have a big loin like this of a veal chop, you just basically cut a hole in the bottom with a thin knife and kind of go in and hollow it out. And then with a piping bag, you put whatever you can into it, whatever you want to stuff it with. But it does work well with pork.
All right, perfect. Actually, can you show us a jar of artichokes, please?
Emma.
There you go.
Got to give a shout out. Awesome. So now we have our artichokes in. Now I'm going to put a little bit of spinach in. But when I cook with spinach, I cook with real spinach, not baby spinach, not the baby spinach that's in those little clamshells at the grocery store. Those are great for salads. But when I cook with spinach, I like using whole big leaves because they have more body. They're harder. They're more firm. So they hold up to the cooking process a lot better than the baby spinach. I find the baby spinach, when I cook with baby spinach, they all just kind of go mushy and soft, and they still taste very good, but I don't know. I just like whole spinach, big spinach. So we layer on a bunch of leaves of spinach, And this again is building on the flavor of the prosciutto, a little bit of earthiness in here. The prosciutto di Parma is a very complex sort of flavor. We always think about it as salty and sweet, but there's a lot going on. So this dish helps bring it all together. Now, the next thing we have is a little bit of parsley. So you can see I just left the leaves really big. Okay, like I didn't sit there and pick it. I think on the recipe I said to chop it, but you don't have to. I don't know why I wrote that. Sounded good at the time, but in reality, just a whole lot of parsley. And like I said, a lot of parsley. Don't be too skimpy with the parsley, because the parsley is going to give it a really nice bit of flavor. So you can see that the top edge, that first edge that we cut, I've left a little bit of space up here, but the rest of it, it's filled. The entire piece of veal is filled. Now, the last ingredient that we're going to do is a little bit of pistachios. So you can do pine nuts with this, but I like pistachio. The sweetness, the toastiness of the pistachios just lend itself better to the flavor of the prosciutto di Parma and to the veal than I think pine nuts. So once this is all done, we roll it back up. So we don't want to roll it too tight. You don't have to like squeeze it, because as the meat cooks, it'll contract. It'll like shrink a little bit, so it'll be nice and tight after it's all cooked. Now it's all rolled up. We got our little tasty secret on the inside, and all we have to do is tie it. So we're going to do a very quick lesson on tying a piece of meat, a little bit of butcher's twine. What we want to do is you start at the top and you slide it underneath. Slide your string underneath, and you tie a little slip knot so that the knot can slide up and down the other line. Keep that right in the center. And when you pull it to the left, or sorry, if your string comes up from the left, when you pull it one direction, it'll tighten back up. It'll cinch up around the meat so you can adjust the amount of pressure. Now, to actually do the next tie, you take your string in line with your piece of meat, you put your hand underneath, and you twist your hand around. And that way you make this little loop. That little loop, you slide underneath, and again, you pull it and it cinches down on top of the meat. Now, you don't have to tie this a lot. You don't have to do, 50 ties. You're just basically holding the meat together. Does anyone want to see me do that again? This way, your string is just hanging there. You go underneath with your hand, and then you twist your hand around the string so that you make a little loop. And then that loop just gets slid underneath the piece of meat. You pull it up and you pull it tight, and you get a nice, secure, little snug closure on your piece of veal. Now, these are about 1.5 inches apart. You can go crazy if you want and do it a lot closer, but really you don't have to. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to roll it over onto the bottom side. I'm going to take my string and cut it twice the length of the piece of meat. And now this is sort of an extra move that I like to do. You don't have to do this, but if you just take your string and you wrap it around the loose end that you just cut, you just wrap it around the strings that come around the side. You can adjust the spacing of the strings and make sure that they're nice and straight. You don't have to do this again. I don't know, makes me feel good when I see a really well tied piece of meat. So now you come back to the beginning. We have the string we started with, the string we ended with. You tie them together, and you're off to the races. Now, I like to trim off my extra string. Again, you don't have to because it is food grade. And that is our veal all ready to go, nice and tied, ready to rock. Okay, any questions before I move on?
Can you just say again if the pork tenderloin is good as well?
Yes, absolutely. You can use pork tenderloin. Pork tenderloin is a nice soft flavor as well. So you can do this with pork tenderloin. It works very well. It's not exactly the same as veal, but it absolutely works. Absolutely works well.
Perfect. Thank you. And then one other question that I'd like to ask you is, why is it that the prosciutto sometimes is very salty and some other times it's not? What's the difference? Is it
So prosciutto di Parma, I mean, or there's different producers produce it with a different amount of salt. When a piece of raw pig leg is received at a processing plant, the first thing that's done is it's salted. The salatore, the master salatore, who is like the king of the place, applies the salt. So sometimes they put a little more, sometimes they put a little less, depending on the size of the leg, depending on humidity, depending on temperature. So that will affect its curing as well, and the saltiness. The other thing is that when you have, my camera just fell over. My poor camera. There. When you have a piece of prosciutto like this, when you start slicing it, the bottom half here will be very salty. It'll be much more salty because it has more exposure with the actual salt. The meat here, you can see it's not protected by the skin. Right. So this piece here will be a lot saltier. As you move up the leg, it'll get less and less salty, more soft. So sometimes if you go to a deli counter and they just started slicing a prosciutto, you'll get these first few slices that'll be drier and saltier, which some people love. I love it. And then when you get up to the middle, it'll be softer and sweeter. So it could be just where it's cut, and it could also be the producer. Oh, that's a big leg.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So next thing we're going to do, because we're going to cook both of these dishes at the same time. So next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start the beans, the cannellini beans. So the first thing we have to do is deal with some prosciutto. So this is the very tip of the prosciutto, and you can find these at good butcher shops and good deli counters. They'll keep these little tips and they'll sell them. Buy them. This is what you should be using to cook with. This has so much flavor. This is awesome. This is what I always cook with. And it is just the very, very tip of the leg of prosciutto. So what we're going to do is open it up, and we're just going to do a fine dice of prosciutto. So I'm not going to bother going over to the slicer to slice it because we want nice small pieces. The skin has already been removed off of this. So it's just a matter of slicing it into little thin pieces. I'm doing about 1/8 of an inch thick. And then we cut it into a nice small dice. And like I said, it's a little bit hard to use on a charcuterie plate. You have a whole lot of muscles coming together. So it's not as delicate as the other pieces. So that's why we don't usually slice these and serve them on a charcuterie board. You can, but it's just a little bit tough. So what we do instead is we dice it up and we cook with it. Oh man, I did a lot. This is going to be good. So a nice small dice. Don't worry if there's bigger pieces. Don't worry if there's smaller pieces. It's going to cook a nice long time. So they'll get nice and soft, nice and delicate anyway. Any other questions, Tiziana, while I'm dicing?
Yes, actually. One regarding the tenderloin and the roll you just made. Can you substitute the artichokes maybe with sun-dried tomatoes or other appetizer-style vegetables?
So you can. I stay away from sun-dried tomatoes for a lot of reasons, and especially with veal, because it's a very, very, very strong flavor. If you do want to use sun-dried tomatoes, you can, but use them very sparingly. I mean, don't use too much. If you use too much sun-dried tomatoes, it'll overpower the flavor of the prosciutto di Parma. It'll overshadow the flavor of the veal or pork. So yes, you can do it, but be very careful.
All right, thank you. And then another question is, if you cannot get the tip of the prosciutto, can you get it cut thicker at the deli?
Yeah, you can always just ask them to cut it, like a heavy 16th or 1/8 of an inch thick. And then you just have to do a quick dice. So for this recipe, one slice from the middle of a piece of prosciutto will be enough to do this recipe. In the meantime, I'm cleaning some kale. So this is a little bit of Tuscan kale. You just kind of wrap your fingers around the stalk and pull the stalk, and the leaf pops off nice and clean. This is the only other ingredient that we have to do any prep to. So we pull this off. We have all of our leaves here. And now we're just going to do a little chiffonade. So like a rough chiffonade. So a chiffonade is a fine strand, but we're going to do it a little bit larger. So we take our kale, roll it up, and then a nice thin cut. It doesn't have to be, a chiffonade is usually like a 1/16 of an inch thick. We don't need to go that thin. We want it to have a little bit of body. We want it to have a little bit of crunch in the beans, and we want to be able to see it and taste it. So a little bit thicker, 1/8 of an inch plus is all good. So our kale is cut. The other ingredient we have are a little bit of cannellini beans. So when it comes to the cannellini beans, you can do it one of two ways. You can get dried cannellini beans and soak them overnight and then cook them in the dish. If you do that, it takes a lot longer to cook, but it's still delicious. Or you can do this. You grab the can of beans, take them out, strain them. Make sure you strain them. Make sure you get rid of all that slime that's in the bottom of the can. And just give it a really good rinse under cold running water. This way it cooks very quickly. Other ingredient is a little bit of grape tomatoes. So grape tomatoes, we're just going to cut them into little pieces, little rounds. And I wanted to show you guys this. You know, sometimes you go to cut a tomato and your knife's not going through. If that happens to you, try doing this. Instead of cutting this way, trying to cut through your tomato, start at the heel of your knife. See if I can do it. Start at the heel of your knife and drag your knife backwards. It's really weird, but it works a lot better when you're doing tomatoes. Is start at the heel of your knife and pull it towards yourself. It just happens to cut them a lot better. And then we have a little bit of garlic and a little bit of shallots already diced. And I got to start cooking or else we're going to be really, really, really late. So a little bit of diced garlic and a little bit of diced shallots. So we're going to take all of these over to the stove. And like I said, we're going to cook both things at the same time. So we start, I got to load up and get over to the stove. So any questions while I'm moving all my ingredients over here?
Yes. One question is, what is Tuscan kale?
Tuscan kale? So
yeah.
it's a type of kale, cavolo nero. It's just a lot thicker and it has a lot more flavor than regular kale. I prefer using it when I cook because I find it has, again, a lot more body, so it holds up to the cooking a lot better.
Perfect. All right. Now we have a comment. Somebody said that they tried the Parma egg baskets with truffle oil that you demonstrated a few class back, and they rocked. So.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's
they're just a nice, quick, and easy little thing. I'm glad people are enjoying it. That's cool.
That was really
okay.
Good. And
so I'm going to start. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I'm going to start searing the veal. So this pan has been on like medium heat from before the time the class started. So you want your pan to be nice and hot. You want to make sure that it's an oven-proof pan because we're going to fire this right into the oven. So make sure that it doesn't have a plastic handle that's going to burn. This is cast iron. It always works the best. It's for the searing, for the roasting, for everything. So if you have a cast iron, dust it off and use it for this recipe. Now what we do is we take our veal and we put it into the pan with a little bit of oil. Oh, it was a little bit cold. And all we're doing here is we're just searing the outside. All we want to do is get a little bit of color on the outside of the meat. Now, you're going to be tempted to put some salt and pepper on the outside here. Don't, because we already seasoned it on the inside. We put the salt and pepper inside the meat, plus we have the Prosciutto di Parma, so it doesn't need any more salt. So we're just going to let that rock. If you're going to do this, these are like, you know, plastic tipped tongs. These work really well for dealing with meat because the tips of the plastic tips won't break the actual meat. If you use like regular restaurant tongs, these are really sharp, so they tend to like leave these little shark bites in the piece of meat. So I prefer using the plastic ones. Use whatever you want. You go in there with your hands even and roll it around. For the beans, we're going to start by cooking our prosciutto. So we take a little bit of oil and nice low heat. This is number 3 on the stove. We put our diced prosciutto right into the olive oil. Okay. Now it's going to need to cook for a while. We want to let this sweat. So sweating is a culinary term that refers to cooking over low heat for a long period of time. It's the opposite of sauteing, and it requires a good bit of patience. So all we want to do is let the fat from the prosciutto dissolve. We want it to melt and come out of the meat. That'll serve as a base for cooking all the other ingredients. We can, at this point, add our herbs as well. So this is a stalk of rosemary. I'm not picking it. I'm not chopping it. Rosemary, when you pick it and you chop it, especially if you have a bad knife, it changes the flavor of the rosemary drastically, and it tastes like soap. So a lot of people who don't like rosemary don't like it because they've had it picked or chopped, or heaven forbid, dried rosemary. If you use it like a bay leaf, you just take a stalk of rosemary and you throw it in, the flavor is much softer and it's much more palatable, and it doesn't offend as many people as when you pick and chop it. A couple leaves of sage, and this is a little bit of oregano. So we're just going to throw them all in whole. This is a rustic dish. The whole idea is this is something that you can do in, I don't know, start to finish. It takes about 15 minutes, 20 minutes to do. This is one of my go-to recipes all the time when I'm in a rush. I know I'm saying that a lot lately. I'm not that lazy, honestly. I cook well at home a lot, but there are a lot of times where I'm in a rush. So fortunately, I always have prosciutto. So I can just dice a little bit of prosciutto and tear this dish off in 15, 20 minutes maximum, if I'm concentrating and not talking. Okay, any questions, Tiziana?
Yes. Is sweating the prosciutto the same as rendering out the fat?
Exactly, yes. So sweating is the culinary term. Rendering out the fat is the objective of sweating. Rendering just means removing the fat from the pieces of prosciutto.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome.
And how do you know how old the prosciutto is? Sometimes they are 2 years old, 20 months. And what's the difference between like an older?
Well, you can tell by the tag that's on each piece of prosciutto. Want to walk over here? Let's walk over here.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
No, it's okay. I can show you on every piece of prosciutto, there is a little metal tag. So if you look at this tag, zoom in on that. So that is Luglio, and I forgot the year already. What year is it?
I can't tell.
Luglio 18. So that tag is put onto the piece of pork when it's first salted.
Okay, wow.
So that's from July of 2018. So that's when it was salted. By the time the prosciutto is done and it gets shipped to us here in Canada, it's usually a couple of months. So you can't count it from the time that you actually buy it at the grocery store, because it's probably been kicking around for a while in Canada. So you have to sort of trust the producers, sort the person who you're buying it from, to let you know how old it is. So you can see here that the prosciutto is starting to get a little bit the fat is starting to get a little bit translucent. That's what we want. And then all of a sudden you'll start to see all this fat pouring out of the prosciutto. That's good. That's what we want. In the meantime, our veal is nice and brown, so we just roll it over. And we want to roll it all the way around. Do me a favor, take the batteries out of your fire extinguisher when you do this. I already did, because it makes a lot of smoke. If you have a really good exhaust hood, that's great. I can't turn mine on or else you won't hear me. So if you're doing this at home, it's a good idea to always pull the batteries, or just warn your whole family that the alarm is going to go off. Okay, so our prosciutto bits are rendering. Our veal is searing. Our ingredients are here. Now we just got to wait a little bit. So this is the patient part of cooking, where you should have a glass of wine or a glass of bourbon or a beer or whatever it is that you drink, so that while this stuff is cooking, you can sit back, relax, have a sip, enjoy your time in the kitchen.
There you go.
I'm going
Or
to try
we
and
can
answer
ask,
some questions in the meantime.
exactly, that's what I was gonna say. Or if we can, you can answer some questions. Okay, so well, with regards to wine, we just got one in. What wine goes best with prosciutto with this type of dish?
Oh, it all depends what you're enjoying it with. Like it's, I don't know. For me, I love a good Lambrusco with my prosciutto. If it's like prosciutto crudo, if it's just sliced, if it's prosciutto di Parma on a platter, charcuterie style, then yeah, I'll go for a Lambrusco.
Mm-hmm.
In this sort of setting, I would go for something, you know, no bubble, something with a little more body, but nothing too crazy. Prosciutto is from Emilia Romagna, so I like to. Prosciutto di Parma is from Emilia Romagna, so I like to stay in the region. So I would usually drink like a Goturno, which is kind of hard to find here in Canada, but LCBO does carry a few. Something like that. It's like a medium-bodied red. With this veal dish, that's what I would probably drink.
Perfect. So
But like I
now,
always say, good food, good wine. Don't worry so much about whether it works together. They're both good, and you enjoy both of them. Just eat and drink.
that works. Perfect. Okay. So as far as pans, like, can you use a cast iron grill pan, or can you put the meat on the barbecue?
Um, I've never tried to do it on a barbecue. Veal, again, because it's so, like, it doesn't have a lot of fat. It doesn't, on the barbecue, you have to be very delicate, especially a big piece like this. With a veal chop, for example, they're great on a barbecue because they're thin, whereas this is giant. So, and by the time the heat penetrates into the core, into the center of this piece of veal, and it cooks it, if I do it on a barbecue, the outside will be so well done. It'll be so hard and dry, it would not be enjoyable. A grill pan could work. The difference with those is that those are dry heat methods of cooking. So it's like a grill is hot air blasting at your veal, so it dries out the meat. Even a grill pan, it's pretty aggressive on the piece of meat. This is a dry heat method of cooking, even though it's in a pan and it's oil, because there's no water present. It's oil. But because it's oil, it sort of doesn't let as much moisture escape from the piece of meat. So you could try it on a grill pan. You could try it on a barbecue. But if you did it on a barbecue, it would be very low temperature for a very long time.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes. Yeah.
All right. So, well, what I wanted to ask you is, when you see prosciutto pre-sliced in the grocery store, how do you know if it's Parma?
So according to the rules of the Consorzio, any prosciutto di Parma that is pre-sliced and pre-packaged for sale has to be sliced and packaged in Italy. So when it's sliced and packaged in Italy, there'll be the 5-pointed crown, the gold logo on a black background on the packaging when it's done in Italy. Here in Canada, there are a lot of grocery stores that will pre-slice their meat, pre-slice all their deli meats, and even the prosciutto di Parma. So basically what it comes down to is trusting your retailer. If they have prosciutto di Parma pre-sliced in packages and you walk over to the deli counter and they don't have any prosciutto di Parma in the deli counter, that's a bit of a red flag. If they have it in the counter and they have it in pre-sliced packaged, it's up to you. You have to decide whether you want to trust them or not. The only real way to know is to stand beside them as they're slicing it. So that's why it's always best to go to the deli counter and just ask for it sliced. When you do it that way, not only you're sure you're getting what you're paying for, but you're getting a much fresher product. The prepackaged stuff, especially if it's vacuum packed, it's very hard on the meat, squishing it down together. And you don't know how long it's been sitting in that backpack bag. It'll last a bit of time in the vacuum sealed bag, but it's never as good as fresh slice. Never, ever.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Okay,
And
so
one very quick thing. Can you just repeat the name of the second wine you mentioned, please? You said
Agoturnio. Don't ask me to spell it because I'm the worst speller in the world. So Gutturnio, I think.
Goturnio. Okay.
Goturnio.
Can somebody please? I guess I'm asking my colleagues. They can write it down in the chat,
Okay,
if
so
possibly. Yeah. Okay. Thank
so
you.
now I'm just kind of giving it a little bit of a roll, just to kind of get a nice even brown on the little spots in between. Now you can spend a ton of time here making sure that every last square millimeter of the veal is covered in nice brown, but I don't want to sit here all night doing that. So I'm going to get it into the oven. So now that it's seared, all we're going to do is fire it into the oven. Really simple. You don't have to do anything else. You take it, fire it into the oven, 405 degrees, and you let it cook. Now, our prosciutto here is starting to get delicious. I'm trying to get some good light here. So they're a little bit crispy, not too brown, but you can see that you don't see the little chunks of fat anymore. Oh yeah, and they're nice and soft and they're nice and delicious. So now we start adding our other ingredients. The pan is a bit dry, a little bit too much. I mean, not enough fat coming out of there. So throw some more oil in here, just a little more olive oil. And if somebody tells you not to cook with olive oil, yeah, you say you don't cook with olive oil, I will. So a little bit of garlic and our shallots go into our little bits of prosciutto. So this needs to cook not very long. This should take just about a minute. All we're doing here is we're softening the garlic, softening the shallots. Oh my God, it immediately smells awesome. The prosciutto and the garlic and the shallots and the herbs. Oh, that smells awesome. A little bit of chili flakes. I'm just going to put a tiny bit in just so that I don't have to argue with my son to get him to eat it. Not into spicy food these days. So we're just going to give this a quick little 1 minute cook just to soften up your garlic, soften up your shallots. Let all those flavors start to come together, start to get nice and delicious. So we have a minute. Any questions, Tiziana?
Yeah, why don't you, I think you mentioned it in one of your previous classes, but I think people like to, know about this. How long can you keep the prosciutto sliced in the fridge?
So if you get it from the deli counter, as soon as it slices, it starts to oxidize. It's not a horrible thing, but it is, not ideal. So you want to use it if you keep it in a nice airtight container. I always take it out of the deli containers and put it into a Ziploc bag because a Ziploc air seals as opposed to a little flap of plastic. In a Ziploc, in your fridge, 3 days, 4 days. You can still eat it after 4 days. I mean, there's times where I find sliced prosciutto in my fridge. It's 6 days old, 7 days old, and I still eat it. It's still good, but it's not at its optimum. So within 3 or 4 days, that's when you really want to enjoy it.
Okay, great.
Okay, so now you can see that our prosciutto is cooked. Our garlic is just starting to get a little bit of color. I don't know if you can see that. Ooh. No. Sorry. Light's bad over here. Anyway, just a little bit of color. You don't want it brown. You don't want it fried. Just a little bit of color. So now we dump in our beans. So our rinsed cannelli beans. If there's some water in the bottom, that's fine. We take our tomatoes and we add half of our tomatoes. Okay? And we give it a little stir so that all that prosciutto is mixed in with all the beans. And we add a splash of wine. So a little white wine goes in, something nice and dry, nothing too sweet. Just like that. You don't need a ton because the beans are cooked already. So all we're really doing here is we're warming everything up. So We give it a little toss. What we want to happen now is we want the tomatoes to sort of break down. We want them to sort of fall apart and make a little bit of liquid into the actual beans. So I turn the heat up here. So up until now, we've been doing it very delicately, very soft, because we want to sweat the prosciutto. We want it to be nice and tender. Now we turn it up because the liquid's in there, so it won't overcook the prosciutto and won't make it tough. So once this comes up to a boil, it's almost done. We want to boil it so that we boil off the alcohol. The tomatoes should kind of fall apart a little bit. And then all we do is we toss in our kale and we're done. So this is a good time for questions too.
Okay. So I have some general questions. Well, first of all, why, like, what goes through the preparation of prosciutto di Parma? Why is it so expensive? What's behind the, you know?
Well, I mean, prosciutto di Parma, it starts with, you know, the breeds of the pigs. It starts with the feed. It's not like a generic meat rearing process. It's not like the pigs are just sort of fed anything so that they get fat. The Consorzio really pays a lot of attention to what the pigs eat so that they stay healthy, and that the quality of the prosciutto is very, you know, very good. The quality of the raw meat is good for the production of prosciutto di Parma. So all of those steps, all of those controls, all of those, you know, I don't know what the right way to say it is. They really make sure that the quality starts from step one, and quality costs. Another big factor is the fact that it's all done by hand. There is no mechanical intervention at all during prosciutto di Parma. The only thing that's mechanical in the aging process are the hams are hung on these giant stainless steel racks that are on rails so that you can kind of push them, and some of them are actually mechanical, and they'll actually pull the whole tray of 500 legs of prosciutto at a time into different rooms. But other than that, everything is all done by hand, and it's done by people who know what they're doing. Last year, I visited a prosciutto producer, and the salatore, the guy who does the salting, was getting kind of old, so they were kind of working on a new guy taking over. So it was his nephew, and he had been working for 4 years just learning how to apply salt. So in the curing rooms, his hams were apart, his prosciutto were in a different part of the area with his name on it in bold letters, because it's not like you can say, this is how much salt you put it on. It's not like you say, put this into the machine and the salt will dump automatically on top of it. It's all done by hand by someone who has to train and learn and, you know, trial and error, make some mistakes, screw up some prosciutto before you get really good at it. So all those steps, and the fact that, again, 2 years, these are hung for 2 years. So the cost of carrying inventory, of paying to have that ham hanging on a hook, that prosciutto hanging on a hook for 2 years, it adds up. It's about the quality. It's about the ingredients. It's about the love, the passion, the tradition that really goes into the production. So, sorry, long answer to a small question.
Oh, that was
I get kind of carried away.
So, what is the best prosciutto di Parma dish you've ever had in Italy?
Oh my God. I can't answer that. I don't know. I've had so many. You know, there was one year, and it would have been, oh man, it was a long time ago. It was probably 22 years ago, 24 years ago. And it was the day that I was leaving, and I was at my aunt's house, and she said, "Are you hungry? You have to eat something before you get on the plane." I'm like, "Nah, I'm good. And she said, "I'm going to run next door and I'm going to grab some prosciutto for you. We'll make a little panino." Okay, fine. She went and got a prosciutto. She went and got some prosciutto, brought it back, and where we're from, it's always prosciutto di Parma. There's no question. It comes back, a little piece of bread, a piece of prosciutto on there. I ate it, and it was, I don't know why. I think about it all the time. I don't know why it was so incredibly good, but it really, truly was. So I ate all the prosciutto that my aunt bought, and she ended up going back to the store 2 more times because I just kept on eating this prosciutto and bread. And that was it. It was prosciutto di Parma and some fresh bread from the panettiere who was right next door. And I just sat there eating bread and prosciutto for like an hour. And then she made me a panino to take on a plane with me because I couldn't stop eating it. I could not stop eating it for some
Well, when
reason.
the ingredients are great, you don't need too many, too
No,
much of the
no,
thing.
no, no.
You just need good quality ingredients and it makes your dish, right? Or your
That's
panino.
true. So
That's
now
great.
I'm gonna throw the kale in. So the kale, I don't want to cook it too long, or else it'll go kind of like ugly brown. It'll go kind of olive brown and get really soft and slimy. So we're just letting the heat of the beans and the tomatoes sort of wilt the kale and cook the kale off. Now, this dish can come in, you can do a lot with this dish. You can add, I mean, there's a lot of times where I'll add zucchini to this, a dice of zucchini. I'll add fennel to it. I'll add a ton of different vegetables to kind of make it more of a vegetable dish and less of a starch dish. But today I just want to do sort of the basis, the basic one. And feel free to add vegetables to this. Add whatever veg you want. It'll be delicious. So now I'm going to take my rosemary out. So like I said, we treat it like a bay leaf. We put it in, we extract the flavor during the cooking, and now we take it out because it's done its job. If a couple leaves fall off of it during the cooking process, like if one of these leaves fall off, don't worry about it. It'll be nice and soft and tender, and most of the flavor will be cooked out of it. So when you bite into it, you won't get that incredibly strong rosemary flavor. Now we take the other half of our fresh tomatoes and we dump them in. I like doing both. You don't have to. You can add all of them in the beginning and cook them off. I just like having a little bit of fresh tomato flavor along with the cooked off tomatoes. So that's our bean dish. I mean, it's really that easy. You can adjust it. You can check for salt and pepper if you want, but I'm going to tell you it won't need any salt. Pepper, if you want, you can throw some extra pepper in there, but I like to keep it kind of mellow and cool. And now we just have to check. So the other nice thing about this dish, about the bean dish, you can leave it in the pot there for 15 minutes and it's not going to get cold. It'll stay nice and hot. So when you're entertaining and you're worried and you're stressed and you're freaking out because of the timing, this is a great dish to do because you can leave it in the pot off to the back, throw a lid on it if you want, and it'll keep its heat for a good long time. So I'm going to check my veal. Whoa.
Did you put any wine, or can you put any wine, Roberto, in the with the veal when you cook the veal?
You can. You absolutely can. I don't normally do it, but if you add wine to the pan, then you're braising it, and you have to make sure that there's enough wine in the pan that it doesn't dry out while it's in the oven. So okay. That's the only caveat, is you have to make sure that there's enough wine that it won't evaporate, or else it'll burn on the bottom of your pan and your veal tastes like burnt. So our veal feels okay. Could go another, I'd say another 5-6 minutes, but we got to get going because I talked a little bit too much. So I'm just going to grab a tray. I'm going to take this out. And ideally what you want to do is you want to let this rest. Now, resting meat is super, super, super important. Whenever you cook a piece of protein, it needs to rest after it's cooked. So whether it's a piece of veal or beef or chicken or turkey or ostrich or elephant or whatever it is you're cooking, you want to make sure that it rests. As it rests, it becomes more tender and the moisture gets absorbed back into the piece of meat. So it should rest. Honestly, this should rest a good 10 minutes before we slice it. But like I said, we don't have time. So I'm going to cut it not resting. Please forgive me. So we're going to go back over to the cutting board and we're going to plate this dish. Any questions before I start carving and plating?
Well, we got one that says, when you rest the meat, will it get cold? No. And then should you cover it when you rest it?
So that is the thing with resting meat. if you cover it, what you're basically doing is making an oven, because the heat will be coming off of the piece of meat, being trapped in the tin foil, and it'll just make a small oven and it'll continue to cook. So you can wrap it, but if you're doing it because you're afraid it's going to be cold, don't, because the meat is being cooked to an internal temperature of 165 degrees. So even if you let it sit at 80 degrees in your kitchen for 10 minutes, it'll get cooler. It'll absolutely get cooler, but it'll never get to the point that it's cold. Now, if something happens, if, I don't know, you burn something else and you have to make another dish, or the cat gets out, or something goes weird and you're entertaining and your meat sits out a little bit too long, don't sweat. Just put it back into the oven on broil. So you turn your broiler on and just put it back into the oven. So you superheat the outside of the meat, but you don't want to put it back in at 400 degrees, or else you're just going to start the cooking process all over again. Mm-hmm. So you just want to, we call it flashing in the restaurant. You flash it in your broiler so that it gets super hot on the outside. And that way you carve it, you serve it to people, they take a piece, put it in their mouth, burn their mouth, and everything's wonderful. They think it's nice and hot and your timing wasn't off. So don't worry about it getting cold. I never tent it. I never put a piece of tin foil on top of it. And I don't know, I served some pretty decent meat. So
perfect. How long was it in the oven for?
It was probably about, I don't know, 12, 15 minutes. It all depends on the size of your tenderloin. So this was a fairly large one. This was a fairly large tenderloin. Like you can see, that's a good 4 inches in diameter. Mm-hmm. So if it's a small tenderloin, it'll be a lot smaller. So it'll cook a lot quicker. Like when you finish stuffing it, it'll be a much, much smaller diameter. So you can see, this is why we want to rest our meat. You can see all the liquid that's coming out. Actually, we can do the other camera. It might be easier. You can see all the liquid that's coming out of the veal. So that's flavor country. That is the juices coming out of the veal, mixed with a little bit of fat. So when I go to cut this right now, all the liquid is just going to come pouring out of the piece of meat. Like it's just going to ooze all over the cutting board. When you rest a piece of meat, all this liquid gets absorbed back into the meat. So letting it rest allows time for the liquid to go back into the protein, and the Prosciutto di Parma that's in there has released a lot of its fat by now. So again, when we let it rest, the fat will be absorbed back into the protein. It'll be a lot more flavorful, a lot more moist, a lot more tender, a lot more delicious. So I'm going to plate this now. Just going to grab a plate because I forgot to grab a plate. And we'll start with our bean mixture. So you can make this a little more moist if you want. I like it being a little bit dry because it won't run all over the plate. And you can see it's still steaming, and my kitchen is hot, and it's been 7-8 minutes since I stopped talking, since we stopped cooking this. So your beans are going to stay nice and hot. Now that in its own is a beautiful dish. You could serve that as an appetizer, and you will have very happy people. But what we're going to do is we're going to add the piece of veal to it. So I'm going to push this out of the way, and we're going to carve our veal. First thing we want to do is take off our string. Okay, don't forget that you tied this. If you forget that you tied it and you start carving, and trust me, it's happened. I've done it myself. You're going to get little pieces of string in your meat, in your dish. So we just want to take our string off. I'm going to carve off the little end, and then go back and carve some thinnish sort of pieces. So thinnish, by thinnish, I'm doing about, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch. And when you're cutting, you see how I'm sawing with my knife. I'm pulling back and forth. Don't just try and cut straight down. You want nice long pulls on your knife. A carving knife works even better. And that way we can get nice, smooth, even cuts. And you can see in here, you see the little swoosh of the green. You have the artichoke hearts here. You have the little pieces of pistachio. pretty awesome. So we take these, and as I said, it should have rested a couple more minutes. If it rested a couple more minutes, it would have been a little bit more done and a little bit more tender, but that's okay. So let me move this out of the way. Now, see all the liquid that's come out of the veal from slicing it? If you let it rest for 10 minutes, your cutting board would be dry. You would carve your veal and you would not get a drop of liquid. That's when you know that your meat has been rested properly. The rule of thumb is you rest it for half as long as it takes to cook. So if you cook it for 20 minutes, you rest it for 10. Okay, so that is our little veal filled with spinach, artichokes, pistachio, and prosciutto di Parma with a little prosciutto di Parma, kale, and tomato braised cannellini beans. Now, you can tart this up with some garnish if you want. I didn't grab any garnish, but you really can, but don't worry about it. It on its own, this is absolutely delicious. Again, this is one of my go-to dishes that I do quite a bit. So give it a try. It's really not that hard. The only technically hard part is opening up your veal, is rolling it out. The first time, the first, second time, maybe even the third time you do it, it's not going to work out so well. And I shouldn't say that. It might not work out that well. But after a few times, you really get the hang of it, and it's really not that difficult.
This is great. Thank you so much, Roberto. It was delicious. It looked delicious,
Cool.
and I'm sure it is. And so I guess at this point, I just wanted to thank you for doing these Prosciutto di Parma classes that were really amazing. And I also would like to send a special thank you to our sponsors, the Consorzio del Prosciutto di Parma, which we hope to have back with us soon for new and exciting ideas in the kitchen. I would like to thank you, my colleagues at the Chamber, for making this possible, especially Astrid, Isabella, and Ilaria, and then everybody else at the office. On behalf of our Executive Director, Corrado Paina, and all of us, I wish you a good evening and buon appetito, and thank you so much for being with us. We hope that you will keep following us on Tuesday and for Pentola d'Oro. Thank you so much. Have a good evening and buon appetito. Thank you, Roberto.
Ciao.